All I want to be able to do is to be that little voice that says, are you having fun? Are you happy?
You're listening to the Happy Doc Student Podcast, a podcast dedicated to providing clarity to the often mysterious doctoral process. Do you feel like you're losing your mind? Let me and my guests show you how to put more joy in your journey and graduate with your sanity, health, and relationships intact. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Frederick, and this is episode 60. In this episode, I welcome Dr. Rosa Arriaga. Rosa received her PhD in psychology from Harvard University, and she currently serves as the Associate Chair of Graduate Studies in the School of Interactive Computing at Georgia Institute of Technology. In this episode, we discuss a number of Rosa's works, so be sure to check out the show notes for links. Rosa, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Heather, for inviting me.
So to give the listeners a little background, you and I met over 3 decades ago in the basement of the Life Science Building at San Diego State University, where we were both involved in a community psychology research study.
Yep. We were kids. We were babes.
We share the same mentor who honed us and prepped us for very traditional graduate programs. We both have our PhDs in psychology. I went off to Brandeis, you were down the street at Harvard. And here we are, fast forward decades later, you are now a computer scientist creating products that are changing the world. And your story is so interesting. I would love to just start there.
Sure. So I think it all starts with a solid graduate career, which is, I think, also your experience. When you receive a good education, when you are given tools as opposed to given an apprenticeship where you now know how to make shoes and then everybody's wearing boots. And so I would say that it all started with a very solid foundation in my graduate work. But even before then, I think, like you said, working with Terry Cronin, a big shout out to her, working with Larry Fenson, they really gave us our foundation, right? Really gave us a set of tools of methodologies that were very clearly rooted in quantitative social science. You and I both went on to basically be social scientists. And in graduate school, I was much more in you might call it cognitive neuroscience. I always say it's at the intersection of epistemology and neurodevelopment. So our baby's born knowing about numbers. What could be more kind of abstract? But also being a happy doc means that you have a balance in your work and your personal life. And so at some point, I was an assistant professor in the psychology department, which I love, Southern New Hampshire University. I loved it. It was my first faculty position, and I loved everything about it. It was perfect for me, but it wasn't perfect for our family. And so we ended up having to leave. And we always say that Georgia Tech made us an offer we couldn't refuse. And that is, since I had a cognitive science background, and cognitive science was also housed in computing, it was a good place for me. And so that transition from psychology or cognitive neuroscience to cognitive science. And then once in cognitive science, I found this area called human-computer interaction. And as I've told you many times, I had never even heard of it. But basically, human-computer interaction came out of cognitive science, came out of people out of UC San Diego that were at this intersection of design and cognitive science. So Dan Norman, if you want to read a book, many people think this is foundational. It's called The Design of Everyday Things. And the interesting story there is that book was originally called The Psychology of Everyday Things, but they said, nah, it won't sell. And in fact, it's become a classic. And so back to the foundation and the methods that I had were a good fit for this new area that I didn't know existed. And so for people that don't know about human-computer interaction is all about building systems or artifacts that are useful and usable, where usability is something we know, right? If the app is hard to use or a device is hard to use, et cetera, et cetera. But really the harder part is it useful? Because we all have downloaded those apps that promise the world, and it's actually not. And so that is really the fun part, is being able to meet experts and then get at this intersection where you're able to design something that's user-centered, right? Because we always say that user-centered design starts with the user, and be able to design it in a way that it's useful and usable. And so back to methods, in human-computer interaction, we use a method called user-centered design. It's also known as design thinking, user experience. But at that foundation is this idea that you start with a user group, that you understand the context, right? So that's like needs assessment or research. And then from that, you move on to ideation, to coming up with a way to address this context that you found. And then you model it. So that's prototyping. And then you evaluate it. So it's this iterative design process. And it really, I mean, it felt like social science, and it is.
And I just want to pause you there because you've got a course on Coursera I'll link to in the show notes. And I took that course, and what you're teaching, those skills are actually applicable to anyone living life.
That's right. That's right. And again, I think that if you saw the evaluation, so now when people say, you know, Rosa, I am an X, where do I fit into this ecosystem? Because as a developmental psychologist, I'm always thinking about ecosystem. But I would say that when people come in, I say, look, as a designer, because now I'm a computer scientist, I'm a designer, I am very good at the needs assessment phase and at the evaluation phase, also known as formative and summative, because that's what social scientists do, right? We describe. So that first phase of describing something so that somebody else can turn it around and design it, I mean, that's exactly what we do. And so I think that that goes back to this idea of what is that toolkit? And I'm sure you can also link to the Changing Academic Life podcast, where I talk a lot about toolkits. But what is it that you're getting in your graduate program? And how is that going to set you up to do things you never thought about, to be in a field you never knew existed? That's the beauty, and that really is the responsibility of a good graduate program.
And what I love about your story is you were open to opportunity, right? This idea that you're getting a toolkit that could make you very valuable in a field that you're not even aware of. And from this strong theoretical background, you're creating apps that are changing kids' lives, adults' lives. Do you want to talk about your app development?
Yeah. So, and this goes back to, again, at some point you start to come up with a set of values, with a set of paths that you set yourself on. And so one of the things that I say makes me different is that, in fact, I do think about theory, and my work is in health and wellness. And when you think about health and wellness, when you think about change, right, behavior change, that's something that psychologists have been thinking about forever. And as a developmental psychologist, my perspective is also that you can't say you're going to change X if you don't think about the entire ecology, right? So that you think about a child, and then you think about the home, and then you think about his neighborhood, his community, the society he's in. Otherwise, you really can't have an ecological approach. And so for me in this career, I've really thought a lot about how do we design systems that obviously are user-centered and that are based on these theoretical constructs of working at the various level of these ecologies. I guess one of the papers you're alluding to is a paper I had that was called "A Text Message a Day Keeps the Pulmonologist Away." And the idea was that we build this text messaging system where we never reminded kids to take their meds. What we did was we made them aware of their symptoms. And this was part of a health belief model, which is a theory of behavior change, which says one of the reasons people don't change is because they don't see a problem, right? And this is something I've heard everywhere. You know, I'm working on PTSD, it's still a problem. And so with this series of experiments, because they were experiments, they were feasibility studies in clinical speak, what we found was that kids that had daily text messages had improved lung function 3 months later. How is that? Well, they were taking their meds. And the idea was that raising their awareness, raising their knowledge actually helped them to say, hey, I am sick. We can put the link to that paper too. But this idea that if you're working on health and wellness, at some point there has to be a theoretical lens, because there are disciplines that know about this and that have been doing this for a long time. And so currently, as you know, I'm using that same ecological approach. I'm looking at post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's an NSF funded grant where we're back to the point I made earlier. I'm working with domain experts because, you know, you and I are not clinical psychologists, right?
That's right.
And they give us the broad framework for what it is that they need to better deliver this therapy. And then we try to understand, how do we design the system so that the therapy might be more effective? So we make it easier maybe for novice therapists to deliver it, and we make it easier for patients to be able to practice it and to do the exercises. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the most exciting parts about, you know, if you think about coming from studying babies and whether they know number, and then coming to where I have evidence that I've built this thing that has improved this child's lung health. It's very satisfying work. And that's one of the things that I love about my area in human computer interaction. You know, I have colleagues in HCI that do kind of future computing, and that's wonderful. But back to a set of values you establish as you do this often enough, that's not something, I always say it's something that's interesting, but I'm not interested. So if I can build something, I want it to be useful and usable now, as opposed to 10 years from now.
Well, it's just such a great story of blooming where you're planted. You've got this temperament. If I had to sum up what makes Rosa such a brilliant mind, I would say it's her courageous curiosity. You were not afraid to ask questions about how things work or why to anybody.
Yeah.
And what I'm curious about is how that temperament, that nature that you have, translates into a role that you currently hold called the Associate Chair of Graduate Studies, and how maybe these ideas of going from theory and models and making things useful is impacting the students' lives where you are now at Georgia Tech.
I hope that I'm having a positive effect on students. And one of kind of maybe a saying that I've coined is, you know, there's a disparaging saying, those who can do and those who can't teach, right? They, you know, again, disparaging, you know, there's a lot of feminist theory where that comes from. But anyway, sometimes there's a lot of negative connotations with administration. But when I say is those that can teach and those that care become administrators. And I really feel that the reason I am an administrator is because I care about the graduate student journey. If people have gotten one thing from my tenure as associate chair, is an understanding that if you're not fine, if you're not well, you can be the most brilliant researcher, but it will catch up with you. I think my philosophy in this position has really been, how do we get students to at least start to think about their wellness? And in every newsletter I put out, I try to say, how are you? And so I think that from a kind of a personal philosophical stance, one of the great things I learned from my graduate career at Harvard was that they knew that the people there are awesome. And the question was, how do we keep them sane? And they did this by having all sorts of activities so that they would try to make you a fuller person. So being from, you know, inner city Los Angeles, I had never been on a river. I had never played kind of intramural sports. And yet they'd say, come and play ultimate Frisbee. Never heard of ultimate Frisbee. Come and row. Come and join crew. What? Again, I think the idea there, which I think is perfect, is you're already great. How do we keep you from not getting crazy? And that is by trying to get you engaged. And so there were poetry readings. And so, you know, obviously not everybody has the same resources, but I think that if students are getting a constant message that it's okay for you to take the weekend off. One of the things, having, you know, been a working class gal, you know, if you put in your 40 hours, there's no need to work on the weekend, right? You need to put boundaries on there. You need to take a break. I would hope that when I left this position, they would say, one of the things that Rosa did is she made at least a conversation about health and wellness central to being a grad student.
There's definitely, whether we want to call it a stereotype, a way of believing that when you're in graduate school, you give up everything to be working in the lab, to be working on your research. And it's not just in graduate school. There are many industries where it's almost a badge of honor to be burnt out.
Yeah.
That you're working, that you're sending emails at 2 a.m. and that you're working on the weekend. And those are the people that are theoretically getting promoted or acknowledged for their quote unquote hard work. But the point you make is so critical, that you can have this brilliant mind, but if it's stressed out and your body's not working, that brilliant mind is worth absolutely nothing to you, your family, your field. So it really is a cultural change that you're infusing where you are.
To take your point further would mean that I would have some agency, right, in how this works. I think that I'm trying to, true to my pragmatist self, what I want is I want students to think about how to keep themselves sane. So even if there isn't going to be a cultural change, because we know that, some people are those personalities, right? Those are the people that come to grad school. My goal is just to say, I am so glad you're doing well, but are you taking care of yourself? Have you, had tea with a person you like? Are you reading a book? Have you seen a movie? Things will go wrong in grad school. You and I know that. And the fact is that if you have other things in your life, then you'll be able to have some perspective. If things go wrong and you've put all your eggs in one basket, you're going to be in a lot of pain. And so my thing is, how do we remind students that there's more to this? It's like having a balanced portfolio, which sounds so bougie, but right? You have to have different things.
Diversity.
Yes, exactly. And so, I think that for me, that's what it's about. Can I start the conversation? Can I not tell you what to do, but can I make a recommendation about, here's a book I read, or here's, something I'm doing, and I'm walking, whatever. Are you doing it too? Again, all I want to be able to do is to be that little voice that says, are you having fun? Because at the end of the day, as you know, my dear friend, what do we have if not that we enjoy our work? Do you enjoy talking to your advisor? Does your advisor enjoy talking to you? If you don't have that, life is too short. And that brings us to tough choices. But at the end of the day, I think, back to the fantastic undergrad education we had at San Diego State, one of my favorite sayings that's kept me through these years is this Euripides play, something like being true to yourself and nothing in excess. Because it's hard, right? Sometimes we want to be the type A and we don't have it in us, right? One of the stories of my awesome graduate advisor who just passed this year, he lived a great life. His name's Jerome Kagan. And he used to talk about, there were 3 types of researchers. There was the big game hunter, and that was the person who was chasing something, that one thing, and that was his life's goal. And this is association. I say memory, you say whatever famous person, right? So these people that have made a kind of foundational change in one area. And then he says there were the policemen. These are the researchers that are all about methods and policies and ethics, right? And then there were the butterfly catchers, people that just went around looking at beautiful things. And when you're at an A1 place, like you were at Brandeis or I was at Harvard, everybody wants to be a big game hunter because that's what you're surrounded with, right? And I remember going to Jerry, like, oh, master, like almost like the Harry Potter, like, what hat will I wear? And he says, Rosa, you're a butterfly catcher. And I'm like, no, I want to be a big game hunter. And he's like, no, Rosa, that's not you. And he was right. Know thyself. Yeah, I guess I'm a butterfly catcher, so I can't work on maybe one thing, but I can find beautiful things in the world and move my discipline forward.
I love that perspective.
Yeah.
So you take your butterfly catcher self, and now you're in a position where you can actually bring to the forefront this conversation of well-being. And I'm curious, are students and faculty open to this conversation? Are they excited that you're kind of talking about the elephant in the room?
Is it working? Who knows? Do I get some feedback? I mean, I always get feedback from the faculty that say, thank you for sending this out. I got a lovely note at Georgia Tech. There's a thank a teacher program where you get to say nice things to people, which is nice, right? Because we usually don't hear it. And this person was saying how nice those newsletters were. And being an academic, that's what we live for, right? Like we love what we do. And so I think that, yes, there is an appreciation that this conversation has to start, and that hopefully this will lead us, again, it's about resilience, right? Why? Because if all we do is grad school and your research will necessarily, there's going to be something that goes wrong. That just, every one of us can show a wound and a scar and say, this is what happened here. That's fine. But if you have some balance, if you can say, okay, but I have book club on Wednesday, and so I will be with my friends and I will discuss this book, and then I'll be able to take a breath and I'll be back. Then that's
with a clear mind and perspective.
Yeah, exactly, right? The famous, I don't even know if it's true, but the famous, anecdote about Einstein always going to the movies when he couldn't do something, right? That's a little bit of balance, a little bit of distraction.
And in addition to talking about the whole person, the whole self, you give some really practical tips in your newsletters. I know from my listeners, they love things that can have an immediate impact. And one thing we talked about before we started recording was this self-reflection piece. Would you mind sharing how you encourage that?
Well, in my role as Associate Chair of Grad Studies, what I say is my role is to remind you of what are those milestones. So in every PhD program, what are your milestones? What are you expected to do in year 1 through 5? You should know this. There are these milestones, to pass go, you have to do these things. Do you know what they are? You should know. If not, there should be somebody like me reminding you what they are, right? And then the idea is that you should be self-reflective about where you are in your career. And back to know thyself, nothing in excess. Are you meeting those milestones? In our program, the first year you're expected to have an advisor and to be making progress towards your research. Why? Because the second year milestone is a qualifying exam where you need to have an oral presentation where you start to show the faculty that you have a set of methods, you know how to interpret those methods, ask a question, answer it with the appropriate methods, and then make the correct inferences, and then have a plan to go forward. That's your second year. The third year is start working towards a proposal, right? The fourth year is you propose. The fifth year is you execute and you graduate. And I say you live happily ever after. And then along the way, there's other things like you have to do 2 graduate teaching apprenticeship because we value this. And so where are you? And then starting your second year, you're supposed to be publishing, you're supposed to be submitting, a paper at least once a year. And so the idea is we have a PhD review, there's a self-evaluation. You're supposed to say, I'm a second year, I'm meeting these milestones, I'm not meeting these milestones. And so, what are those milestones for you out there? What is expected of you? Are you talking directly to your advisor about them? As I was getting ready to put out my end of term email, I was saying, as I was going around all these things that we need to cover, the thing is communication. Are you actively communicating with your advisor about this? Because you need to be responsible for it. And you cannot expect reminders, right? I'll get emails like, I wasn't reminded about, that as a courtesy, I will send the timeline of things that are happening. But as a grad student, I expect you to know your milestones, and I expected to know these deadlines that are really important.
Yeah, Dr. Casuto calls it being the CEO of your education.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, and what I think might be happening is we're almost trained now. We get a text message from our dentist. Don't forget this is happening. And so it's almost like we're living in this culture where we are being constantly reminded to do things. And you get to graduate school, and I can't tell you how many students will say, I didn't know. And maybe, okay, you could say, well, it's the first time they're doing a doctorate, so maybe they're expecting more feedback or more reminders. But when you're in a doctoral program, there is a huge responsibility that you're going to take the initiative and know what's going on, when it's going on, and be really real and candid with yourself. If we think about the students who take an incredibly long time to graduate, or maybe even leave ABD, you could probably trace a lot of that back to not understanding the milestones and doing self-reflection along the way. There was probably writing on the wall early on that this wasn't going to be a good idea for this person.
But also, I think that reflecting on your book that's coming out on your why, I think people misconstrue their whys. What's expected? It's kind of what I'm expected to do this. I'm a really smart person, and really smart people get PhDs. That is not a why that will sustain you. And so I think that back to some of the things that you talk about in your book that I think is really valuable, it comes back to, again, know thyself, nothing in excess. And then the other thing is what happens when you get feedback, right? Because on the one hand, it's not failure, it's feedback. How do you get that feedback? You talk about setting yourself up for success with how you schedule these things. And again, you should be scheduling time for a break, right? But how do you make sure that you are where you should be? And I think that some of it is feedback. And when I first moved into HCI, I had a student and she was incredibly bright, but she was just always missing these milestones, not for lack of trying. And, finally, I had to say to her, you're not shining in this program. In this program, you're always a dime short and a day late. And that's not who you are. You're so interesting. You're so creative. And the good news is, obviously it hurt and she left the program, but now she is living the life that she should be living without the pain of X more years of this. And so whenever I feel bad about these situations, I have to say, you're meant for better things. And it's not good to be in an environment, a toxic environment, where you're constantly falling short.
Yeah, I believe we all have a life purpose. And some people, that life purpose is that doctoral degree. And for others, maybe they had to get on that journey to figure out that wasn't their life purpose. And that's totally okay.
I completely agree with you, Heather. I think that if you're true to yourself, then you will ultimately get to where you want to be. But will you listen to the feedback that you're getting? At the end of the day, life's too short to be unhappy. Mm-hmm. If you're dreading, if you are dreading seeing your advisor, if you are dreading that next class, if you are dreading that next paper, if you go to your advisor,
rethink your life.
Yeah. And it could be, and this is not to say that there are not mismatches. I always tell students, when they're accepted into our program, they're accepted by the entire faculty. That means that if it doesn't work out with Professor Smith, then you'll be able to find another advisor. And I have examples of that, people that have moved on to do great things with other faculty. So that's the other way to think about it, right? Maybe it's just not a good match. That's life.
Yeah, maybe it's a change within the program. Maybe it's a change outside of the program. But what I love is that you are bringing to the table basically this idea of permission to talk about being a whole person, but also permission to be okay with leaving something that's not working for you, whether that's an advisor or an entire program.
That's exactly right.
With the end goal of being true to yourself, nothing in success, and
that's right.
Happiness and joy will follow.
Amen. That's right. That's right.
Well, Rosa,
we're having a fest, isn't it? So I have to give your audience one of my favorite Rosa Heather
stories.
And so Rosa and Heather were in undergrad. Then Rosa and Heather were in grad school. And every once in a while, Rosa would complain about somebody or something. And Heather would say in her Zen self, now, Rosa, wouldn't the world be boring if there were just Rosas and Heathers? And I'd say, no, it'd be awesome. So anyways, here we are, just you and me, Heather. What could be better?
I can't think of a better way to spend my Thursday. And it was so great to have you on the show and to have you share your inspiring story. And so thank you for taking time out of your busy day to hang out with me.
Thank you so much. Happy Doc.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out the links in the show notes, and I look forward to connecting with you on the next episode. Until then, here's to more joy in your journey. The Happy Doc Student Podcast is brought to you by expandyourhappy.com, and you can learn more there. Oh, and hey, if you want to make my day, would you rate, review, and subscribe to this show? One more thing. Just a quick reminder that the information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only.